Plasma blasts rocked the Relentless's battered hull as it charged recklessly at the advanced Draconis warship, an act of defiance from the rusting human freighter turned frontline fighter. Captain Kevin Sullivan's prosthetic fingers dug into the handrail, steadying himself against the impacts, while sparks rained from overloaded conduits. The forward view screen showed the sleek alien ship looming ahead, its cannons locked on their bucking craft. "Sir, aft shields are failing. Power's fluctuating all over the ship," the ship's engineer called out. "Divert everything to shields and engines. Seal off breach decks," Kevin commanded. He knew the Relentless was outclassed, but he refused to back down. The data on board could expose a critical Draconis weakness. Getting it back to Earth Command was all that mattered, even if it meant his life. A tattered photo of Admiral Sullivan, Kevin's father lost defending Earth against the Draconis, fluttered on the damaged console. Flames flickered in Kevin's eyes. He wouldn't let that loss be in vain. "That arrogant Draconis Captain Pryler thinks he can crush us," Kevin shouted over the blaring alarms. "We'll give him a fight he'll never forget." He signaled his crew. "Charge the EMP cannon. Shunt all remaining power. We're going right at them." Shouts of shock and fear erupted. The experimental weapon could disable the Draconis ship, but the massive power surge would overload the Relentless's strained systems. They'd be dead in space. But Kevin knew it was their only shot. The Relentless accelerated on a ramming course, its abused engines screaming. The bridge went dark, lit only by blinking emergency lights. Proximity warnings blared. The alien ship filled the view screen. "Now!" Kevin slammed the firing controls. The EMP blast erupted from the prow as the Relentless careened past, its hull scraping the Draconis ship. Metal screamed. Consoles exploded. The Relentless spun away, trailing debris and venting atmosphere. Systems failed. The dying ship drifted. The Draconis vessel turned ponderously, facing them through clearing smoke. Running lights flickered, then strengthened. The nameplate stood out. DSS Vengeance, Praetor Pryler's flagship. "Looks like this is it." Kevin gripped his father's photo as the Vengeance's ports opened, cannons emerging. "But I'm going down fighting, like a true Sullivan." He glared at the looming gun barrels, refusing to blink as they began to glow, locked on the crippled Relentless. One final defiant stand against impossible odds. The Sullivan way. The Vengeance's bridge shook from the blasts, control panels sparking and overloading. Praetor Pryler stared at the view screen, his mouth hanging open as he gripped his command chair. He watched another human fighter smash into the Vengeance's shields, detonating in a blinding fireball. "Intensify forward firepower. Destroy those insignificant gnats," Pryler roared. The tactical officer slammed controls. "Our targeting systems can't lock on, sir. They're too small and fast." The deck heaved under Pryler's feet as more kamikaze fighters rammed his ship. Warning klaxons blared and crewmen shouted frantic damage reports. Pryler seethed with rage and disbelief. Mere minutes ago, victory was in his grasp. The Relentless was crippled, its crew helpless before the Vengeance's might. Now, impossibly, a swarm of human ships had appeared as if from nowhere, throwing themselves at his warship with reckless abandon. A bone-shaking impact sent Pryler sprawling. He hauled himself up to see a spiderweb of cracks spread across the bridge's armored viewports. A human frigate, engines flaring, had just rammed the Vengeance head-on, the collision reverberating through the ship's hull. "Shields at 30%, an officer shouted. "We can't take much more of this." Pryler felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he stared at the battered human ship swarming his flagship. For the first time, he knew fear. On the Relentless's gutted bridge, Kevin watched the ragtag human fleet hurling itself against the Vengeance. Frigates, destroyers, even refitted cargo ships bristling with guns, all pounding the Draconis warship with everything they had. The Relentless's comm crackled. "Kevin, get out of here. We'll hold them off." His father's voice strained but fierce. Kevin slammed a fist on the flickering helm controls, knowing he had no choice. He had to get the Relentless's intel on the Draconis weakness back to Earth. Gritting his teeth, he coaxed his crippled ship into a limping turn. As the Relentless slowly pulled away, Kevin watched the human ships swarm the Vengeance, tiny gnats harrying a giant. Fighters smashed themselves against the warship's hull, frigates pounded it with streams of fire. The Vengeance's shields flared and flickered under the onslaught. His father was out there, Kevin knew, Admiral Sullivan, the man he'd always strived to live up to, throwing himself into the teeth of the enemy so his son could escape, sacrificing himself for the mission, for Earth, for Kevin. "I won't let you down, Dad," Kevin whispered, his eyes wet. "I swear it." The Relentless limped on, the sounds of battle fading behind it. Kevin kept his gaze fixed ahead, not looking back, his father's face etched in his mind. The future of the war, of humanity itself, depended on him reaching Earth. He wouldn't fail, no matter the cost. Kevin's hands flew across the Relentless's sparking control panels, his jaw clenched with grim determination. The ship shuddered and groaned, its hull riddled with scorch marks and jagged holes. Somewhere deep within its bowels, the engines sputtered and whined, struggling to maintain what little life they had left. "Come on, you piece of junk," Kevin muttered through gritted teeth. "Just a little further." He'd managed to coax the ship's failing systems into some semblance of functionality, rerouting power from the damaged sections to the engines and FTL drive. It was a patchwork solution at best, but it might just be enough to get them out of here. Kevin's fingers had just brushed the switch to engage the FTL when a shrill proximity alarm tore through the bridge. His head snapped up, eyes widening as he saw the sleek, predatory shape of a Draconis fighter bearing down on them. "Shit," he hissed, recognizing the distinctive red and black markings of Praetor Pryla's personal guard. The fighter was closing fast, its weapons already glowing hot. But it didn't fire. It didn't need to. Kevin knew that fighter could easily outpace the limping Relentless and disable it with a few well-placed shots. They wanted the ship intact, wanted the intel it carried. Kevin's mind raced, desperation and adrenaline surging through his veins. He keyed the comm. "Hawkins, overload the reactor and eject the core now." In the engine room, Sergeant Hawkins blanched, his face going slack with shock. "But, sir, that'll—" "Do it," Kevin barked. "That's an order." Hawkins swallowed hard, then nodded. His hands shook as he initiated the overload sequence. On the bridge, Kevin watched the Draconis fighter grow larger and larger in the viewscreen, until it seemed to fill the entire view. He could almost feel the heat of its weapons, the predatory intent radiating from its sleek hull. His eyes flicked to the countdown timer. 3, 2, 1. At the last possible second, Kevin wrenched the control yoke hard to the side. The Relentless groaned in protest as it flipped end over end, the stars spinning crazily in the viewscreen. And then the reactor core detonated. For a moment, the entire universe seemed to turn white. The Draconis fighter, too close to evade, vanished in the searing glare of the blast. But the Relentless, caught in the edge of the shockwave, fared little better. The ship screamed as the force of the explosion slammed into it, sending it tumbling wildly out of control. Alarms blared, and sparks flew as consoles overloaded and blew out. The hull shrieked as it began to buckle and crack, unable to withstand the stresses tearing it apart. "Abandon ship," Kevin roared over the cacophony of destruction. "All hands to the escape pods." He hauled himself out of the command chair, fighting against the centrifugal force trying to throw him across the bridge. His crew were doing the same, clawing their way towards the escape pod bays as the ship disintegrated around them. They barely made it. Kevin had just slammed his fist on the launch button when the Relentless finally gave up its fight. With a tortured groan of rending metal, the ship cracked apart like an eggshell, spilling debris and bodies into the cold vacuum of space. From the tiny porthole of his escape pod, Kevin watched helplessly as the flaming wreckage of his ship scattered across the stars. The intel, the vital key to humanity's survival, was lost among that drifting debris. But there was no time to grieve, no time to think about his father's sacrifice. or the brave men and women who had just given their lives to buy him this chance. Because his pod's short-range sensors had just lit up with new contacts, the Draconis fighters' wingmates, homing in on the Relentless's last position like sharks scenting blood in the water. Kevin's hands flew across the pod's rudimentary controls, his eyes scanning the limited star charts in its computer. There, a faint glimmer of hope, a tiny, unremarkable planet a few light-years away. It was charted, but uncolonized, the kind of place the Draconis might overlook in their search for survivors. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. Kevin broadcast a quick burst of encrypted orders to the other escape pods, praying that at least some of his crew had made it out alive. Then, as the Draconis fighters streaked into visual range, he reached for the emergency FTL control. His last thought as the pod leapt blindly into the void was that he had to survive. He had to find a way to complete his mission. No matter the cost. Kevin gripped the harness release as the escape pod juddered and shook, the overloaded FTL drive sputtering dangerously. Sweat beaded on his brow, his heart pounding against his ribs as he watched the cracked viewport. The distant glimmer of the uncharted planet grew steadily larger, filling his vision. The pod gave a violent lurch, alarms blaring in Kevin's ears. The FTL drive cut out with a pathetic whine, leaving the pod to the mercy of the planet's gravity well. Kevin barely had time to let out a stream of curses before the pod began to tumble end over end, the inertial dampeners struggling to compensate. He was slammed back into his seat, the harness digging into his chest as the G-forces mounted. Through the viewport, he could see the pod's hull starting to glow, the friction of re-entry turning the metal cherry red. The heat seeped into the cramped confines of the pod, making it hard to breathe. Kevin fought to stay conscious, black spots dancing in his vision. Just when he thought he couldn't take any more, the pod hit the ground with a bone-shattering impact. It carved a deep furrow into the earth, throwing up a spray of dirt and vegetation, before finally coming to rest at the base of a massive alien tree. For a long moment, Kevin just sat there, his ears ringing, his body aching. Slowly, painfully, he reached up and released the harness, wincing as he felt the bruises already forming on his chest. He kicked at the pod's hatch, the warped metal resisting for a moment, before giving way with a tortured groan. Bright sunlight spilled into the pod, making Kevin squint. He hauled himself out, his boots sinking into the soft loam of the jungle floor. As his eyes adjusted, he took in his surroundings with a growing sense of unease. A dense primordial jungle stretched out in every direction, the trees towering hundreds of feet overhead. Strange calls echoed through the humid air, the cries of creatures Kevin had never heard before. He checked his pod's computer, sighing in relief when he saw that the atmosphere was breathable, if a little high in nitrogen. But his relief was short-lived. The pod's comm system was fried, the screen displaying nothing but static, and there was no sign of any other pods, no indication that any of his crew had made it to the surface. He was alone. Kevin felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach as the reality of his situation sank in. The intel on the Draconis weakness, the key to humanity's survival, was lost. Scattered somewhere in the vast wilderness of this alien planet, amidst the wreckage of the Relentless. And he had no idea if any of his crew had even survived the crash, let alone where they might have landed. With the Draconis undoubtedly searching for any trace of the humans, he knew it was only a matter of time before they thought to look here, on this seemingly insignificant world. Squaring his shoulders, Kevin turned back to the pod. He rummaged through the debris until he found a few supplies that had survived the crash, a sidearm, a couple of ration packs, a basic med kit. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Using the sun to orient himself, Kevin struck out into the jungle, the dense foliage quickly swallowing him up. He had to find his crew, had to recover the intel. No matter what dangers this strange new world held, he would not fail. High above, just beyond the planet's orbit, a Draconis scout ship drifted. On the bridge, the commander leaned forward in his chair, his slitted eyes narrowing as he studied the readout on the screen before him. "Well, well," he hissed softly, a predatory smile spreading across his scaled face. "What do we have here?" The readout showed a faint energy signature, the telltale sign of a ship's emergency landing. The commander tapped a clawed finger against the screen, zooming in on the source. It was coming from the planet's surface. Days dragged by as Kevin, Chen and Rishi scoured the dense jungle, searching for any sign of their missing crewmates or the Relentless's wreckage. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and exhaustion dragged at their limbs, but they pushed on, driven by desperation and a flicker of hope. On the fourth day, as they hacked through a tangle of vines, Kevin spotted a glint of metal in the underbrush. His heart leapt into his throat. He surged forward, ignoring the thorns that tore at his skin, and dropped to his knees beside the twisted remains of a data core. Its light still blinked feebly. "Is that—" Chen breathed, her eyes wide. Kevin nodded, hardly daring to believe it. "The intel, it's damaged but intact." He reached for the core, fingers trembling. At that moment, a plasma bolt seared the ground inches from his hand. Kevin whirled, his blood turning to ice as a Draconis landing craft shimmered into view at the edge of the clearing. A squad of soldiers poured out, weapons raised. At their head stood the scout ship commander, his rifle leveled at Kevin's chest. "Surrender the data, human," the commander hissed, his eyes glinting with malice, "and I'll grant you a quick death." Kevin exchanged a glance with Chen and Rishi. In their eyes he saw his own grim resolve reflected back. There was no choice, no surrender. In a flash, they drew their sidearms and opened fire. Plasma bolts crisscrossed the clearing as they scattered for cover, the air thick with smoke and the stench of singed flesh. Kevin weaved between the trees, clutching the data core to his chest as if it were his own beating heart. A cry of pain told him Rishi had fallen, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. The Draconis commander was hot on his heels, crashing through the undergrowth. Kevin could almost feel the alien's breath on his neck. He burst from the tree line and skidded to a halt at the base of a steep ravine. Whirling to face his pursuer, Kevin raised his sidearm, only to find it empty, its power cell drained. His stomach turned to lead. The Draconis commander stalked forward, his rifle aimed at Kevin's head. "Nowhere to run, human. The data now." Kevin glanced down at the data core, then back at the commander. A strange calm settled over him, the kind that only comes when all options have been stripped away. "You want it?" he asked softly. "Go get it." With a final defiant yell, he hurled the data core into the ravine with all his strength. The commander's eyes widened in horror as he lunged forward, clawed fingers grasping, but it was too late. The core vanished into the mist-shrouded depths, lost. Enraged, the commander slammed the butt of his rifle into Kevin's face. Stars exploded across his vision as he crashed to the ground, blood filling his mouth. Through a haze of pain, he saw the commander standing over him, weapon raised for the killing blow. But before it could fall, the world above them erupted in fire. The Draconis scout ship blossomed into a fireball, the shockwaves slamming into them like a physical blow. The commander staggered, his head whipping up in disbelief. Through the smoke and swirling embers, a battered but achingly familiar shape roared into view. The Relentless, impossibly back from the dead. "Sorry we're late, Captain," Admiral Sullivan's voice crackled over Kevin's comm, strained but alive. "Had to make a few repairs." As the commander gaped in shock, Kevin lunged. He tackled the Draconis soldier, grappling for the rifle. They hit the ground hard, rolling in a desperate tangle of limbs and snapping teeth. Kevin felt the edge of the ravine crumbling beneath them, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. The ground gave way. For a heartbeat they hung suspended, still locked in their deadly embrace. Then gravity seized them, and they plunged into the mists, the commander's hate-filled eyes boring into Kevin's as the world rushed up to claim them. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.